The two most popular saturation tools in Resolve are actually the two that you should never use if you want to craft beautiful images. In this video, I'm going to show you what these tools are and what you can use instead to get more filmic feeling saturation in your grades. Along the way, I'm going to share some little known insider knowledge about saturation that's going to help you level up this critical part of your color grading practice. Okay, let's take a look here inside of Resolve at these two saturation tools that I literally never touch when I'm grading. The first one is right here in the primaries. It's the first saturation tool that most of us get exposed to when we begin color grading. It is the saturation slider down here at the bottom of the primaries tab. And to get a sense for what my beef is here and why I say I never use this, let's take it for a spin. I'm going to turn it up to about a 70 or so. And let's take a look at the before and the after. Before, after. Now, when we look at this, we can observe like the image does indeed feel more colorful here than it did here, right? So it's not a total fail in that sense. It is doing what it says it's going to do. It is saturating the image. That's about the only good thing that I can say about this tool. There is nothing that I like about the way that it is accomplishing that task. And this really leads me to an important point that we're going to return to many times in this conversation today. Saturation is a derived component. It has no specific definition in the world of motion imaging. Cameras see red, green, and blue, and displays show red, green, and blue. Saturation is what we can call a derived component, meaning that we need to use some kind of math or some kind of model, a term we'll return to in just a couple minutes here, to derive our saturation channel. The model being used here for my primary saturation is not my friend. I don't love how it is behaving. And if we understand where this saturation adjustment comes from, it's maybe not that surprising. This saturation adjustment was never designed to be used in the way that I'm using it right now. It was never designed to creatively grade images. It was never designed to operate on log state images like I am right now. It was designed to make small adjustments to broadcast video shortly before it went to air. So it's maybe not surprising that it's not yielding results that are really aligned with what I am looking for. Okay. So let's go ahead and grab a still of our saturation adjustment. And if you don't see what I'm seeing in terms of why this is so terrible or what looks so bad, don't worry. We're going to continue to explore and look at different alternatives. And it's always easier to compare one thing to another than to say in a vacuum that something looks great or terrible or mediocre. So this is number one on my no-fly list, the primary saturation adjustment. And the last thing that I'll say here, we started by talking about the color model that's being used here and how the color model is not one that I really prefer. The other dimension that makes this saturation adjustment less than ideal, and in fact, the other dimension that we can use to evaluate any saturation tool is once you've used a model to derive your saturation channel, what are you doing to it? In this case, we are applying gain to this saturation channel, which works the exact same way as applying gain here in my primaries. It means that the brightest or the areas of highest signal strength are going to be affected the most, and the areas of lowest signal strength are going to be affected the least. So in a saturation channel, that means stuff that's already very saturated is going to be affected the most, and stuff that's not very saturated is going to be affected much less. Okay? So let's keep that in mind as we push forward now and look at the second saturation adjustment on my no-fly list. I'm going to go ahead and label this still up here in my gallery so we can start to line up our comparisons. Let's reset this. And we're now going to look at another tool right here in our primaries, the color boost. It's maybe not a coincidence that we're going to be going through these tools roughly in the order they were introduced in Resolve. This primary saturation slider has been here longer than any other saturation adjustment in Resolve. This color boost comes shortly after it, and it was really designed to address some of the pain points of the saturation slider. Namely, that when we reach for our saturation slider, the stuff that gets the most impact is the stuff that's already super colorful. So the color boost was designed to remedy this. And if we look at turning our color boost to the right, and I'm actually going to wipe to our primary saturation version so we can try to get to like a similar kind of comparison point here. So let's wipe full frame. Here is our, let's go back over this way. Here is our color boost right here. And here's our primary sat. Color boost, primary sat. These look pretty similar, don't they? I'm going to point to the biggest discrepancy, the biggest difference between these, which is going to be the paint in the upper left and the lower left corner of this image. So here in our primary sat, it is more saturated and it is brighter. Here in our color boost, it is less saturated and it is darker. That is because the color boost is performing a different operation once it has moved into its derived saturation space. So remember that model that I mentioned a moment ago that I said I don't love with the primary saturation? It's actually the same model with our color boost, but on the bright side, the operation being performed is better. In the color boost, we are having more effect on low saturations, less effect on high saturations, which is in stark contrast to the way the primary saturation works. Primary saturation, we're having the most effect on saturated stuff, less effect on lower saturation stuff, which is why when I look at color boost versus primary saturation, my colors are exploding out a bit more in my reds and warm area of my vector scope here in the primary saturation than they are in the color boost, where they're being less affected, and instead lower saturation things are climbing up a little bit faster. So the color boost was introduced to solve some of the pain points of the primary saturation, but it really only solves one of the two. That one being, okay, what do we do once we moved into our saturation space, once we have our saturation channel? But that first thing, that model that's being used to define what is saturation, how am I going to calculate that saturation? It's actually the exact same as our primary sat. And as I said, it's not something that I feel like is particularly robust or does a particularly good job of deriving a convincing type of saturation. So the search continues. This is number 2 on the no-fly list, the color boost slider. Okay. Next, I want to go over to the HDR palette. Again, we're going to be retaining our theme of roughly working through the chronology of saturation tools in Resolve. They've gotten better. They've gotten more sophisticated over time, right? Let's go to the HDR palette here. And we're going to go to the global section, and I'm going to adjust my global HDR saturation here. And what that's going to allow me to do is get a different kind of saturation in the image. Let's get over to our global section if we can. There we go. And I'm going to adjust my global saturation like so. And once again, I'm going to wipe to the previous version of our image so I can kind of try to match the overall level of things. So here is our color boost. Here's our HDR global. Color boost, HDR global. Remember when I told you a minute ago, don't worry if it's not clear to you that this looks so terrible. Hang on, it's going to be easier once we start to compare. Can you see how that's true now? This reminds me of something that a colorist friend told me a couple of years ago now when we were doing an interview that's always stuck with me. Everything looks good until you see something better. That's what this reminds me of, because a second ago, even when we were doing our primary saturation, you might have looked at the image after I pumped all this saturation in there and gone like, yeah, okay, that's bold, but I don't see why Colin says he would never use this. It's not that bad, right? But now compare primary sat to HDR sat. Primary sat, HDR sat. I think most of us would prefer the HDR sat, right? It really feels better. It feels more organic. And this primary sat, by comparison, feels really garish and video-y and just kind of pushed, right? One of the things that's going on here that is facilitating a more convincing, more organic, more filmic feeling image here in my HDR sat is we're starting to touch on a really important physical principle of color, of light, of saturation. Let's just think about something for a second here. If we are thinking about saturation as something physical, like I wish to increase the saturation of an object in my scene, before color grading even gets involved, how would I do that? What would that involve? What that would involve is using a surface or a material or an object that is more selective of the light that it reflects. It only would reflect, for example, a very narrow band of red, and it would absorb all other colors or wavelengths of light, right? So if we are focusing in how much red or how much color in general a given surface or object is reflecting, that means that it is going to absorb more light, right? That means that it's going to become darker. This is what's sometimes referred to as subtractive saturation, which I feel like is a bit of a misleading or a confusing term because it sounds like some sort of aesthetic preference, or at least that's the way the term has kind of been adopted and is most often used these days. But I feel like we're really just talking about physical plausibility, to use a simpler term. It's like, is that a physically plausible adjustment? Notice here in our primary sat, especially in areas of high saturation, like our reds up here in the painting, we have the ability pretty easily with an operator like the primary saturation to actually turn a surface color into a color that feels emissive. It feels like there's light coming off of it because it is so physically implausible, right? So we're starting now as we look at our HDR sat to touch on honoring that physical principle and on using models which do a better job of honoring the physical principle that, typically speaking, if something is going to become more colorful, it must also become darker. That's assuming it is a surface or an object rather than an emitter, which is a lot of what we are color grading when we're making adjustments to the saturation in our images, right? So this HDR sat, I feel like, is the first nod to observing the physical plausibility of adding color to the image and not doing so in a way that can turn things that were reflective so that they start to feel emissive, like they're actual sources of light, and make things really feel weird and organic and like overly worked on. That's the number one thing, or one of the number one things anyway, that I feel like makes an image feel like a colorist was there, is they really crank that saturation too hard using a model that makes stuff that was reflecting color feel like it is now beginning to emit color. Okay. So HDR sat is the first of our couple of options that we're going to look at that are functional options that can actually get us good results. Now, the model and the operation that's being used here are not fully documented anywhere in the Resolve documentation, so it's a bit of a black box. But if I judge this on its merits, how it looks, I can tell you that the model being used and the operation being used are at least functional. It may not be all the control or aesthetic that I would want in a perfect world, but it's much more functional than we've looked at with our color boost or with our primaries. So let's grab another still. This is going to be our HDR Global. And we're going to continue to explore. I'm going to show you one of my favorite methods of controlling saturation in Resolve. We've actually done dedicated videos on this here on the channel, but we're going to dive back into it right now. Let's once again reset this node. And I'm going to right click on this node now and go to my color space and select HSV. This is one model for saturation. In fact, it's a model for hue, saturation, and value, but we are interested in the saturation calculation that it makes. Okay. So we're going to go into HSV. We're now going to right click again, and we're going to turn off channels 1 and 3 because we are now in HSV. Channel 1 is H, channel 2 is S, channel 3 is V. We don't care about H or V. We just want to manipulate our S channel, our channel 2. So with those two turned off and with HSV enabled, we now have the ability to shape our saturation in the HSV color model, which can yield some pretty cool results. So let's start to adjust not our HDR wheels, but our gain over here. All right. Now I'm going to start spinning this to the right. And once again, I'm going to kind of like reference to one of our other examples to try to get a similar net level of saturation. And I think we're kind of there now. Let's go ahead and make sure this HDR adjustment is fully reset. There we go. So as I wipe to these, now we're really starting to embrace this idea of subtractive saturation, or as I like to call it, physically plausible saturation, in the sense that I'm adding lots of color, but the areas where the image is taking on color are getting heavier, right? Because the premise is that these areas would be more narrowly reflecting certain wavelengths of light while absorbing all others. So HSV is pushing us even more strongly into this realm of subtractive saturation, which again, we can sort of slice up into aesthetic category and say like, oh, it's filmic. Oh, it feels like film feels and behaves like film. Those things can all be true about subtractive saturation. So you can take your pick as to whether we like saturation in general because it emulates film, or because saturation of this type, subtractive saturation that is simply more physically plausible and feels like something that happened in front of the camera instead of something that some overzealous colorist did in their grade. Okay. So that's our HSV set. Now there's more that we can do here. Things get really interesting when we use this node. Remember, what are our two criteria for any saturation adjustment? The two things that determine how well or poorly it's going to perform. What is the model being used, and what is the operation that we are performing once we have calculated our saturation channel? The model being used here in HSV, it's HSV. It's a lot better than what we are getting, for example, here in our primary. But the operation that I'm doing right now, it's just gain. So that's actually the same operation as in my primary sat. But because of the way this node is set up, I can actually shape what we could call a saturation curve using a combination of gamma and gain. So you might remember, if you've adjusted gamma in your primaries before, that gamma is going to affect everything in the middle of the image. It's going to pin black, it's going to pin white, and it's going to affect everything in between, right? So going gamma up in HSV mode is a great way of boosting saturations in the body of the image, as opposed to the very tippity top highest saturations, which is really what gain is going to do. And in fact, you can go gamma up, and I often like to go gain down. So I'm controlling peak saturation and boosting low saturation. Similar premise to what color boost does, but we have more control over it. We can actually shape out the curve by playing gamma and gain against each other, and that's pretty neat. I'm going to show you one more bonus here before we move on off of this HSV node setup. I really like this HSV node setup, in case you can't tell. Here's another option that we have available. Let's reset this gamma adjustment, or this gain adjustment rather. And actually, before I show you this final little tip within HSV, I'm going to go ahead and grab a still of what we have here thus far, just so that, again, we have kind of a comparison point with these other saturation tools. So here's our HSV. So we're now going to go into our custom curves over here after I reset my primaries. And in these custom curves, we can exert even more control over the what do we do to the signal part of the equation, part of our saturation tool. We can really shape this out to do whatever we want. I can say, okay, I really want to have like a strong, aggressive takeoff in my very low saturations. And then I want those to really fall off as I climb. And I've got all this control that I can exert over my image. Now, I might not want to do this or need to do this for every single shot, but having this level of control is pretty cool. And it's something we really can't do anywhere else in Resolve. This is the only way to control saturation in this way inside of Resolve, with one exception that I want to mention anyway. Over here in our HSL curves, all of these HSL curves that have a sat dimension, so that would be hue versus sat, lume versus sat, sat versus sat, and sat versus lume. The model that's being used, remember our two criteria, what's the model, what's the operation? The model being used in all these is fundamentally the same model as the one being used in our primaries. So it doesn't mean you can't ever use these for anything, but it does mean, especially for adding saturation, you're going to get the same wonky results in a slightly different way here in your various HSL curves as you would by adjusting color boost or even primary saturation in your primaries. Okay. So it's that same kind of faulty color model that's being used that could use a facelift throughout Resolve, but that's the one that we're living with in many areas of Resolve still. But regardless of the sat versus sat being this one other way that we can manipulate our sat curve, as I said, it's using that undesired model. So we're going to be much better off using this HSV setup, using our custom curves to effectively do our own saturation versus saturation curve and control the entire journey from low saturation to high saturation. Okay. Lots to like here in this HSV setup. I have this actually as part of my template node graph. I use it so consistently. It's a really great, effective way of controlling saturation to whatever extent that you need to finesse it. All right. But we're not done. We're going to take a look at one more really good means of controlling saturation within Resolve that gives us way better results than our two most popular tools that we started our conversation with. That's going to be our color slice tool. Once again, our theme of working through the chronology of tools in Resolve continues to hold. Color slice is a very new addition to Resolve, and I am a fan of this tool. I think this type of tool has been badly needed in Resolve for some time, and there's a lot that I really like within this tool. I don't think it's perfect. It has some issues. I'll touch briefly on that in just a moment, but color slice in particular has a great saturation model. Remember our two criteria once again. What's the model? What are we doing once we've used that model? The model itself within color slice is the very best color model that's available anywhere inside of Resolve for saturation. That's just my opinion, but I feel like it derives and creates a really good saturation channel that can lead to really, really good looking and feeling adjustments. So if we take it for a spin, let's just take this saturation knob and turn it to the right. And let's wipe against our, maybe our HDR global until we're getting to like kind of a similar level for our sat. Okay. Just going to keep going with that. So something like that. Similar to what we saw with our HSV. And by the way, this color slice is most similar to HSV in terms of the model that's being used. Similar to what we saw here, we're really encountering this theme of subtractive saturation. Like, hey, if we're getting more colorful, we're definitely going to feel heavier, right? So we're absolutely seeing that play out here in our color slice. And this is a really powerful tool for introducing a more preferable, more filmic, more organic type of saturation into the image. Okay. So the model being used is really good. The downside is the operator, the operation. We're back into the land of gain. So it's just gain that's being applied, which in many cases is not what we want to see. But that's kind of the trade-off here with color slices. We've got a really good model, not necessarily the best operator, but there's something else to really, really like about color slice that makes me reach for it consistently when I'm color grading. And that is these individual vectors that I have here. So I have vectors for red, green, blue, cyan, magenta, yellow, and skin inside of the color slice. Now, remember when I said a moment ago, there's things that I don't think were done perfectly with color slice that I am not super happy with. The main thing I'm talking about when I say that is this skin vector. I would highly discourage using it under pretty much any circumstance, but these other 6 are going to be really great for you. The skin vector is just too narrow and it produces chattery, noisy, artifacty, problematic results. So I tend to avoid it. But these other 6 vectors are great. And for example, if I wanted to really push the color in my cyans, I could do so by pushing my cyan saturation. That's a functionality that we can kind of get in other areas of Resolve, but none of them can do it quite as easily or as quickly as I'm able to get in Color Slice, nor can they do it with aesthetic results that I like as much as what I see here in Color Slice. So this is a really great tool to add to your arsenal. Like I said, its baseline saturation model is the best one that I think is available anywhere inside of Resolve. And as a kicker, it gives you the ability to control saturation at specific hue vectors and not just global saturation. So for me, in my practice, I am spending my time, dividing my time between the HSV node that we looked at a moment ago and my color slice tool, depending on what I'm trying to do. Each has pros and cons. The HSV node gives me more control over my sat versus sat curve than any tool inside of Resolve, except for the other sat versus sat curve, the HSL curves, sat versus sat curve. But again, that one's kind of on the no-fly list because it uses that really icky model that we started our conversation with. So the HSV node setup gives us the most control over our sat curve, but it doesn't really allow me to target my saturation at particular hue angles. The color slice, on the other hand, does not give me really any control over my saturation curve. It's just gain being applied either globally or at these specific hue vectors, but it uses a really good model and it allows me to saturate at those particular hue vectors and control my image in that way. So between these two, you've got a really potent arsenal for shaping out the saturation of your image at low, medium, and high saturations, as well as at various hue angles. And that's why these two are my go-to for manipulating saturation here inside of Resolve. I think the HDR Global gets an honorable mention. And as we said, Color Boost in primary. Sorry, guys. I've spent a lot of time with those tools and they've gotten me through a lot of color grades. So I wish them a farewell, but they're going to be permanently benched because unlike when I started color grading, when I first started learning color grading, those were like some of the only ways of adjusting saturation available inside of Resolve. That's not the case anymore. We've got all of these cool tools that we should be taking advantage of, and we really need to be retiring Color Boost and primary saturation permanently. So thank you for your service, Color Boost and primary, but you guys are going to be benched indefinitely. So I hope you guys enjoyed this walkthrough of saturation and not only saturation tools that we should avoid inside of Resolve, better alternatives, but what to look for in a saturation tool and a better understanding of, and I hope you've gotten a better understanding that is, of what it is that makes a saturation tool or a saturation adjustment successful or one that is less successful or feels overdone or feels like it's got a colorist's hands on it. There's a lot to understand about saturation, and maybe the biggest thing to understand about it, it's sort of similar to the way that I learned about contrast when I began my color grading journey. I started my color grading journey by thinking of contrast as one axis, right? Low contrast, medium contrast, high contrast, where on that axis do I want to plot? Of course, I learned very quickly that contrast is a multi-dimensional thing that can be shaped and controlled and finessed in all kinds of different ways when we're color grading. Saturation is the exact same thing, maybe even more so, but at least as much so, because we can control low saturations, medium saturations, high saturations, saturations at particular hue angles, saturations in different color models. There's all kinds of creative freedom and expressiveness available to us when we are manipulating saturation. And the very first step to taking advantage of that creative freedom is to recognize that we have it and to move away from using a single knob like a saturation slider in our primaries, and to start to think about saturation in more of a multidimensional way. So hopefully this video has helped you to begin doing that. Let me know in the comments if so. Let me know what questions you have. And we're going to be talking about saturation plenty here on the channel going forward. It's one of my favorite topics. It's one of the least understood aspects of color grading. So I hope you've enjoyed this first dive into the topic, and I'll see you here on the channel for the next video.